Hello, everybody. Welcome to this panel discussion where we're going to be talking about communicating core values inside and outside. Now, I do a lot of panel discussions about sustainability and, loads of fascinating things come up, but I always find there's one element missing, always. And that element is communication about it. Now, someone will probably tell me, we talk about it, blah, blah, blah. To me, that doesn't matter. What matters is the advertising and the language around sustainability. Because frankly, in the 1940s, we, meaning human beings, sold cigarettes to pregnant women because we said, this is the favorite brand of pregnant women, smoke these cigarettes. And that was the ad agency, and we did it. And Philip Morris is still around. So to me, it's clear, we can convince people to do anything. So it's my delight to welcome my two guests today, one of whom is from advertising, the other is from communication and corporate and social responsibility for major brands. So I think we're going to have a really spirited conversation, and I hope we're going to uncover some new ideas. So let me introduce the guests. Andrew Essex was a co-founder of Droga5, one of the most noted and most important advertising agencies anywhere globally. Between them, the Droga5 leadership had more Cannes Lions awards than anyone else in the industry. Anyone. So it's a spectacularly successful industry. From there, he went to Tribeca Enterprises to become CEO and then founded his own company called Plan A. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Simon. Great to be here.
Toby Usenick was head of philanthropy for Christie's, the auction house. He actually built that capacity for them. And so a very public-facing role and a pioneer in that world. He departed Christie's a couple of years ago and founded his own interest called Philanthropic Impact to do similar kind of work, but without a corporate watchdog, shall we say. And he also wrote a book called The Caring Economy. Actually, I should refer to, Andrew also wrote a book called The End of Advertising. So Toby, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you guys.
All right, so the first thing that strikes me is, and I want to try to keep a hand onto sustainability, but this is going to go to a lot of different areas. And that is, what are companies saying versus what are they actually doing? Because we're all familiar with the term greenwashing. Frankly, you walk down a supermarket aisle for the last 15 years, and there's something colored green because you're supposed to buy it because it's colored green. And I suspect in advertising, that became like, oh, that's a good idea. Let's do that. Let's make our thing, pick out anything we're doing that's even faintly green and call ourselves that. And that's how we'll be judged. What's your experience of that? Andrew, you were in advertising, making these things happen. So of course, it's all essentially your fault.
Once we establish that principle, everything flows smoothly from there. It's all my fault. So the question is, what have I seen companies do as it relates to greenwashing?
In terms of how's greenwashing evolved, and are there any notable elements of companies saying something about themselves that you find egregiously false or perhaps particularly true?
Well, unfortunately, more false than true. So the fundamental problem is that most companies have two divisions that don't speak to each other. They have their marketing and advertising function, and then they have their corporate social responsibility function. And it usually represents about 1% of their spend, and it's ghettoized and treated as a rump state to essentially solve problems that might affect stock price. So invariably, the work is not good, the central premise is inauthentic, and the strategy is so egregiously obvious that it accomplishes nothing. So why don't we use right now a particularly unliked large social media company that's under attack for its insensitivity as it relates to political speech. So they are in the middle of a campaign to say, we are good, we are a force for good. And they show laudable initiatives that might support female entrepreneurs or a variety of other positive and well-intended campaigns. But the motive is so transparent that it doesn't really accomplish anything. And it's also communicated in the context of advertising. So it's interruptive and it's inauthentic. And I think it's an incredible waste of money. And I've always advocated to companies when they want to do something like this, and I've had so much experience dating back 20 years, is stop saying and start doing. And it's much better to do something than to say something, take the money you're spending in this essentially completely ineffective communication and actually invest it. So that's.
I just want to bring Toby in on that, because Toby, you created the CSR concept within Christie's when you were working there. So what steps did you take to create that? And then, I mean, it's something that I know you personally are very, very strong about. how did you try to avoid the perception of it being seen as advertising or a marketing ploy?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the corporate social responsibility platform at Christie's was called Art and Soul, and our effort was to try and bring a little bit more meaning to our interactions with our stakeholders, because Christie's is about art, and it can be more soulful or less soulful, depends on how much you want to go there as a brand. So where I am, both personally and in my writing in the caring economy and on this larger topic, is I try to encourage people to think about it as both caring, because language can really confuse things or put people off. Is it CSR? Is it citizenship? Is it sustainability? Is it environmental, and so forth? And it gives people reasons not to engage with doing a better job at being more responsible. So I talk about caring as the concept. And then secondly, I talk about a spectrum of caring, because I think all of this gets back to individual brands, individual CEOs, individual employees, and how much they care or not. So I try not so much to judge the brand or the CEO or the individual on where they are right now in this moment in time, but where they are in saying, this is where we are, and this is where we're going to put our stake in the ground and say we're going to do better and move further along that spectrum of caring. So even the most sort of, let's say, poor examples of late of brands, like I think of Dolce & Gabbana and their misfire in China last year. Even there, that's a client I would take on happily, so long as they genuinely, authentically wanted to learn the lesson and really learn from it and pivot to a better place vis-a-vis China. Otherwise, they're not moving very far along that spectrum of caring. And so I think it would be, I think, frankly, it was crocodile tears that they were crying last year at their press conference.
So that's an interesting point, because I'm very interested in the genuine internal motive of the company versus the greenwashing. And Andrew, I'm going to talk about a campaign that I know you worked on, your company worked on when you were at Droga, which to me, I felt it spoke volumes about the kind of company that it was. I don't know if that's true or not. There might be a bunch of Trumpists, but, you know, and you'll tell me that they're not, of course. But it was the cracker, this is wholesome. Honey-made, yeah. It brought me to tears every time I watched it. And it was my perception of it as a consumer was it was a commercial about this is wholesome, and it showed different types of families. Two dads, you know, a rock and roller playing the drums with his kid, mixed race families. I don't even know why we have to call them mixed race families, but anyway, mixed race families. And it was like, this is wholesome. And of course they got a ton of hate mail for it, and they knew they would. Why on earth wouldn't they? And then there was a follow-on from there. So to me, and it's not sustainability, but it is corporate values. And I think that communicates what their corporate values are, because this is a Midwest brand. You know, I don't know where they're based, but it feels like a Midwest brand. And they were fully taking on those conservative values that the Midwest claims to hold so dear.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up that example, and there are a couple of points that I want to points I want to point to that illustrate my previous point. So very pointy. So the brand was Honey-Made, and the parent company is Mondelez, which used to be known as Kraft. So this is a quintessentially American brand based in Minnesota. But this was an advertising campaign, not a corporate social responsibility initiative. This was their mainstream advertising campaign. And they weren't intending to change the planet or to support an initiative. This was how they were communicating how to sell crackers. Okay, so let's be clear on that. The crackers themselves were made from 3 ingredients, and it was clear that the product was essentially wholesome. It was just flour, water, and sugar. So if the product is wholesome, how do you communicate wholesomeness? And it seemed like the obvious thing to do was to support the idea of the family evolving, and that certain ideas that we had about the family being unwholesome were actually incredibly wholesome. So family now means, as you said, mixed race. It means multiple genders. It means multiple pronouns. It means single parents, multiple kids from other families. The idea of family is evolving, but always wholesome. And this actually sold more crackers at the end of the day because people felt an affinity towards this. But it was not about a peripheral initiative. It was their mainstream advertising campaign.
But that was a risk because, you know, there's plenty of, so what kind of company, especially a big corporate one, decides to take a risk like that? Because they didn't have to take that risk.
That's true. That's true. It requires real leadership. but it also requires an understanding of the consumer and where the marketplace is going. So they just try to be authentic and just to say, our product has been around for a long time. It's always been wholesome. Families have been around for a long time, but families are evolving. So let's update the definition of what the family is. And it wasn't, at the end of the day, that risky. They knew that they would alienate some people, but they didn't want those people as customers. And the data, because this wasn't just a gut reaction, the data indicated that most consumers were embracing this evolving idea of the family. So I would say it was principled, but it didn't take a tremendous amount of bravery. It took self-awareness and intelligence just to recognize this was the smart thing to do rather than to make really crappy advertising that people would ignore.
I mean, I'm heartened by that, and I can't pretend to not be a little bit surprised.
Yeah, it was incredibly surprising.
Yeah, Toby, you wrote the book, The Caring Economy. So you've spent a lot of time looking at businesses and entities and countries that that try to do the right thing and either succeed or fail. Mm-hmm. Have you seen bold initiatives by groups that you found either laudable or perhaps the opposite, shallow?
Yeah, absolutely. So building on Andrew's remarks, I will say that another key word for your audience to keep in mind is commitment. So once a brand goes there, it becomes very clear very quickly how committed they are to it and their employees. And if it's successful, the more optimized impact comes from a real commitment through the organization, something that's integrated into the business model, not a bolt-on. So my favorite example right now, I just interviewed for my podcast that launched. I mean, the podcast has been out, The Caring Economy, on Spotify, but this week I interviewed on Monday and posted yesterday an interview with Damon Jones, who's the Chief Communications Officer at P&G. So it's a nearly 200-year-old brand with about 100 household products that we all use every day, from Febreze to Crest toothpaste and Pampers and on and on. And they have done, in my estimation, an incredibly powerful and committed exercise around race. And for the past couple of years, they've been doing a series of small films along with all kinds of forums around it and promotional activities. But the most recent one that came out in the wake of George Floyd's murder is called The Choice. And The Choice, I highly recommend it to you and your viewers, is to look at each of our roles in race and the choices we make consciously and subconsciously on an ongoing daily basis, if not minute by minute, on how we move through life and what we do with our positions, our clout, our power, or not. And it's gritty, it's raw. It builds on a series of several other films they've done, one around hair, which is quite a cultural phenomenon, really, if you think about people of color, and even Japan. They've done a great ad campaign in Japan. I didn't realize, but in Japan, there's a socialized expectation that women, when they interview, will have straight black hair pulled back in a ponytail, and that's the only way. So they took that on in Japan and brought in diversity as a topic of discussion. So I would say P&G is high up in my mind in terms of not only their commitment to social issues like race, but how they're following through on it and going there. Because as Andrew noted, you'll get a lot of hate mail, and Damon talked about that. But in their gut and in the core of their leadership, they know that this is exactly where they need to go, and that beauty is not defined by a skin color.
So I'm bound to think, I used to work at Nike, so I'm bound to think about them and their support of Colin Kaepernick for the Just Do It anniversary, and the fact that they made a big splash about that and they didn't need to. And, you know, some people are like, yeah, well, that's good business. Well, yeah, it is good business, and they're a good company that makes a lot of money. They're very, very successful. But they didn't have to do that. They could have had a really compelling campaign without using Colin Kaepernick. But they chose to do it. And whether it's true or not, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But I hear that their marketing head was apoplectic when someone suggested not using him because it might be controversial. Mm-hmm. So, something that keeps coming home to me is that the leadership has to embrace doing the right thing. Because if they don't, you can't be cynical about this. You can't be. If the leadership doesn't believe in it, it's not going to be, because it's going to be a one-hit thing, and then they're going to go back to the old ways. So if Nike's so successful, and P&G is a pretty big company as well, and they seem to be trying to embrace it, why isn't everybody doing it? What are the reasons for people not embracing sustainability, embracing inclusion, moving in the direction that the world appears to be going?
Well, personally, I think everyone, for the most part, is doing it, at least with the multinationals, which is where I focus. But they do it in different ways. It's quite individualized, and some do it better than others. Some do it with greater gusto, and those are the ones that we read about and hear about, or else the misfires that we hear about. The same time that P&G was launching the Choice, you had Mars and Quaker Oats and ConAgra all pulling old brands like Aunt Jemima and Mrs. Buttersworth and Uncle Ben's, because they finally were ready to acknowledge that it's too racist, too stereotypical, and they're going to make that change. They didn't get as much positive feedback for it. I should say they were behind the 8 ball, I think, whereas I believe P&G was ahead of it. And so they're all moving in the right direction, Simon. So that's where I go back to this concept of an individual on a spectrum of caring. So that they're moving in the right direction is a great thing. But it also needs to keep moving. So I think in the spirit of this conversation and communicating core values, it's a campaign, right? You don't stop. You keep on exercising that CSR muscle and trying to get better and better all the time, raising the bar on yourselves, having ongoing dialogue with your stakeholders, your investors, employees, customers, to make sure that you're getting better and better. And that exercising of that muscle, I strongly believe, is what will help a brand pivot when it needs to. It will help a brand inoculate itself to some degree when something really bad happens. And I'll share an example later on in today's conversation about that. So I think it's really, all these good deeds, so to speak, are helpful or additive, but what really is the ideal is the optimized impact. So I think in the case of Colin Kaepernick's social justice, Nike has stayed there. They were committed, they took the risk, and they're not letting up on it. And now we're seeing Black Lives Matter, and it's not going away. So kudos to Nike for all its reasons for doing what it did.
So I think that's very different to companies suddenly going, oh, turns out we've been racist for loads and loads of years. We should probably stop being racist today. That to me is, I'm not really going to give them credit for that. I'm going to have to say to them, well, why were you racist yesterday and you've stopped today, and you think I should thank you for that? But anyway,
well,
the point is
the dialogue. Yeah, it's the dialogue that's what really matters.
Yeah. But
I want to point out one, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Simon, but one
Okay.
quick point. It's easier comparatively easier for Nike than for Procter & Gamble to make decisions like this, because obviously Nike is one brand and Procter or Mondelez is a house of brands. So you've got exponentially more complexity in terms of management decision and who's going to be the brave leader. So with Procter, with a CMO like Mark Pritchard, who actually has values and stands for something, he's trying to affect change across an incredibly broad horizontal portfolio. Very, very difficult. Yeah. And I just want to just amplify something that Toby said, which is exercising the CSR muscle is absolutely right, but that muscle, in my humble opinion, has to be part of a body, a unified theory. And I continue to argue that you do not peripheralize CSR. CSR is core to your marketing. And this differentiation is increasingly meaningless. Marketing should be socially responsible. So the idea that you have a division that only does social responsibility is just simply ludicrous, because by definition, it means your regular marketing is not socially responsible.
Agreed. I think the ideal state is the utopia, as I've written in my book, is when CSR goes away.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. See, this is great. Like we haven't had this conversation before, us three, but I'm thrilled that we're all in the same place, because to me, I don't want to hear about CSR office. That's ghettoizing CSR.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
And I like to think of when you go to visit Ralph Lauren's headquarters, right? If you're in the accounts department, you still know you're in Ralph Lauren's headquarters. It's not like, design happens in design and everyone else wears, Kmart. You know where you are because it's in every
unified theory.
Yes. So who do we think is doing a good job with this, and who needs a little bit of help?
Well, I'll give you a real-time example I was referencing a moment ago, and it's in the fashion and in the sustainability space. You may have read yesterday or 2 days ago in Women's Wear and in the Wall Street Journal, Esco, world's largest shirt manufacturer, has been put on a short list by the U.S. government for using forced labor in Western China around Urumqi. I have written about Esco. I know Marjorie Yang, the head of Esco, and her daughter Dee Poon, and I have spoken at their conferences. I consider them good friends, and I actually believe that they are being put in the crosshairs of the China-US trade wars that are going on right now. I have followed their CSR, John Tse, their CEO. This is a brand that has done more, I believe, to raise the quality of life for workers and the best practices of the fashion apparel business manufacturing in mainland China for years now. And that's where I talk about sort of an inoculation. I believe that they have inoculated themselves enough to be able to counter those charges yesterday in the press and say, we will fight this vigorously. This is completely false. And they've got my support because I know them, I've been with them, I've been to their factories, not the one in Urumqi, but I have been to their other factories. And I think that, you know, this is apropos the core values communicating, Simon. One thing we cannot prepare for fully are those surprises like a COVID-19, or in this case, being put without notice from the US government, being put on a list, like not even given a chance to prepare or give your response. And so I think that they will, I hope, and I will help as best I can to help them prevail in this situation because they have done more to improve the quality of life for workers and manufacturers in China than I think any other brand.
I think that speaks to brand equity. And Andrew, I want to ask you about this because there are certain brands that they have got so much in the bank that if someone said, oh, they just set fire to a house full of puppies, I just wouldn't, even if I saw the film of it, I wouldn't believe it because I would feel like I know that brand does not stand for that kind of behavior. Yeah. So it takes a while to build that up. If you got, I mean, I'm reminded of and I don't even know the facts, but I'm sure you guys do. There was some drug tainted issue in the US. I think it was Bayer. Yeah, and they, instead of just taking that drug off the shelf, they took everything off the shelf.
I don't know.
You know, we're going to go massive overkill. So you know the kind of people that we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's textbook. That one is still studied in business schools around.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess it's judge us by our actions, right? So instead of the advertising, but the irony is that the advertising campaign is the outward expression of it can be, of who you are.
So I would say again I'm sorry, Andrew, do you want to?
No, please.
I would say that with COVID-19 as an example, I'm looking regularly for the silver linings. And I think there was a silver lining coming from the business community out of COVID-19. And specifically, it was in a crisis mode, does a business do the right thing? And if you think back to when it was all unfolding, it's hard to believe how much time has passed. But almost within 48 hours, all businesses, sectors, sports leagues did the quote unquote right thing. They shut down. They didn't have the contingency plans that they would have loved to have had. Some of them did, but not prepared for COVID. But by and large, these brands did the right thing and the nation shut down in 2 days' time. And I think that's phenomenal. And we don't necessarily take stock of that because lives have been lost and there's still so much work to be done. But I do believe that more businesses than not are responsible and that the leadership of these brands have been born into families and communities that have supported them. So they know what caring is in their heart. So part of my message in my book and in my consulting is to take people back to that basic concept of caring. And if you look at it that way, I think most brands are going to try and be on the right side of history. Most brands did shut down with COVID. Most thought twice before they reopened if they had that option or are thinking about it. And we're seeing day after day this week how the airlines and the retailers are all requiring the masks that absence federal leadership, in my view, we're endangering lives because of not having a national policy, but at least the business leaders who have nationwide or global businesses are doing the right thing. And I think that that's laudable.
I mean, when you look at Larry Fink several years ago, communicating that if any of the companies within the BlackRock organization are not embracing trying to deal with climate change, he's going to unseat them. And when you look at that scale of business influence doing the right thing, then it seems evident that the business community at least is aware of the realities of the world, even if the political is less so. Andrew,
and the opportunities with it.
Yes. What are you seeing in terms of communication that is sort of during and post-pandemic that you think is either particularly good or particularly bad? Because I'm sure everyone wants to be seen to have done the right thing, and many companies have, and many companies have not. You know, I'm always excited by massive mistakes in advertising and how people have done it wrong, but also, you know, as in the case of the cracker company, which I forgot again, Honey, what's it called?
Honey Maid.
Honey Maid, there you go.
I'll send you some crackers.
Thank you. They were doing I'm going to go and find something in the supermarket, so they've actually benefited from me being aware of it. But they were doing the right thing anyway. So the question is, are you seeing communications, this your world, that you think is inspiring either for being good or actually the opposite?
That's a very good question. Not particularly great stuff. There has been some reporting on the fact that a lot of brands are falling into the same strategy as it relates to post-pandemic communication. We're all in this together. We all stand as one. It becomes a little bit cliche and banal. And when it comes from a player that isn't necessarily associated with that idea, it can seem extremely transparent and even mercenary in some regard. I find that this is a time when consumers may not want to hear from brands. And there's a strong argument for doing nothing. And sometimes it's better to do nothing and to stay out of the way. So what's scaling right now? Fun viral videos from Sarah, what's her name? The woman who does the show. Yeah, Sarah Cooper. That there's a great bit of communication that's so completely on the mark that it generates its own momentum. But I really don't want to bang on Facebook, but I do see a lot of Facebook CSR stuff that to me is really, really transparently intended to raise their brand health and is probably doing the exact opposite in a lot of people's minds. It will really hinge on Zuckerberg's testimony in front of the Congress on Monday. So when you're so desperately trying to tell people that you're good, it's transparent. And I would advocate for a little more leadership and self-awareness instead of myopia, and to assume by simply actually engaging in paid media that you're convincing people that your message is resonating. So the other thing that I advocate for is for people to think more about the context in which the work appears. So remember, you are interrupting someone if you're using traditional advertising channels. Do they want to be interrupted in the first place? And is the interruption welcome or unwelcome? Does it add value to people's lives in any way? And a message basically saying, hey, I'm good, is not necessarily sincere. It doesn't work in actual interaction. Simon, let me tell you how excellent I am, and let me tell you about all the good things I'm doing. Oh, I think you'd probably turn the other way, knowing you in particular, right? So a little self-awareness goes a long, long way.
But there must be brands that are succeeding in advertising now. Because, you know, you're right. When I look at advertising and they go, my dad said, use this product and I've used it. And at the bottom it says paid actor. You think, what is the point of this?
But let's go back to Nike for a second. So Nike has tremendous brand equity. They've always been a courageous player. They have a tagline that everyone knows, arguably the most famous in the entire business, just do it. And then when there's civic unrest or violence against people of color, they say, just don't do it. Arguably the most brilliant brand campaign of the last 5 years.
It's so good. Adidas picks it up.
Right, exactly. But just think about that. Just there's a way of behaving with your brand values, reinventing a line that already has tremendous equity, a tremendous amount of creativity, sensitivity, awareness, a good ear to what's happening on the ground. That's to me the gold standard.
There's a bad example in the same arena a couple of years ago when PepsiCo pulled an ad that they had run with.
I was hoping you would reference that.
Did you take that one, Andrew?
He gives the cop a pep. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, of course. I was going to bring it up myself.
Yes, I've written about it in the Caring Economy. So she gives the Pepsi, and they realize they missed the mark. So it's there again. I will still support Pepsi so long as they admit the mistake and they own it and they really want to learn the lesson. So it's, you know, I think less about the advertising per se, Simon, and more about the platform. So for example, I'm a big fan of TikTok. I think that we always have to have national concerns around technology, whether it's Huawei or TikTok, but at the same time, it's pure market forces that are driving its success. And when you see someone like Sarah Cooper on TikTok or Twitter, then that says to me, I want to be doing more on those platforms, whatever it is, or I want to be seen on those platforms, however it is, versus a traditional ad that might not really move the meter for so many consumers.
So I was talking to Jeff Staple a couple of years ago for a podcast, and he's a very, very influential streetwear designer that most people haven't heard of, but he's right up there with Supreme. And he was saying that in his community, which is young, you know, streetwear kids, he said, if it feels really polished, they won't believe it. It's
Right.
got to feel authentic. It's got to be genuine. It's got to be a shaky handheld phone video. Otherwise, we're not buying it. And of course, that's what TikTok is when it works.
Yeah.
You know, so when are we going to see, when a corporation is going to actually realize how to fake that? Because of course, if it's good and it works, then corporations want to be able to do it automatically using their advertising department. Or is it actually a real sea change in communication? Because, you know, I suspect right now it's a sea change in communication, but only up until the point where ad agencies can commoditize it and persuade big corporations to do it.
I mean, one big sea change we're seeing is obviously the move to mobile, right? So whether it's TikTok, Facebook, and by the way, for the record, I despise Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg even more. I think that they are completely greed-driven, and it's appalling that they get away with what they're getting away so far. But I hope these boycotts continue because they need to. It's pure greed. Sorry to be so subtle, but I think that mobile.
I don't care. They'll come.
I was bad. That's awesome.
Mobile is.
Hey, listen, no. To be fair, he communicated his core values. That's what he did, and that's the serious point. He did. He said, "This is who I am. I don't care. They'll come back."
And then he changed them, right? It was connecting the world, and then it was changed to bringing the world together because they realized in connecting the world, they were fostering hate, and they still are. So, and I mean, having worked at the New York Times for 5 years and defended a news organization in the media, I can tell you that Facebook does function in many ways like a news organization, and they should be held to the same accountability, the same standards, because they are, I think, derelict in their duty.
But why has Facebook got it so wrong? And Jack Dorsey seems to be doing a much better job with Twitter. They have their problems, but you know he's stood up and said, "No, you know what? I'm not having that. I'm going to do this." And you know it's cost him a bit.
I have two theories on that. One is that he's a more responsible leader, and the people that work there are. But also Twitter, it's one of its strongest constituencies is journalists, and journalists understand their responsibilities, and they understand deadlines and exclusives and scoops, and they function according to what I would describe as a traditional news gathering or news reporting organization, as opposed to social platforms like Facebook that say they're just bringing people together. But in fact, they are giving news. They are probably, I would guess, a huge percentage of American consumers get their news, quote unquote, from Facebook.
So Andrew, you've had much of your career at the top of communication. If you were helping Facebook to evolve, what would you have them do?
First off, as Toby said, leadership has to change. So I'm very, very, very bearish on Facebook right now. And I think you have a situation, to quote Chris Hayes, where you've got unprecedented power in the hands of far too few people who do not appear to have any perspective on what their product actually is and the damage it's causing. But this is a problem because no one can force Mark Zuckerberg to resign or step aside. I believe the company has to be broken into 3 pieces, and it requires a stronger board and new leadership. It's time to pass the baton to responsible people who are actually adults. But given that, I would say they need agencies that stand up to them and don't make more of this wallpaper communication. When you tell people, again, you're a force for good, and people don't feel that way, you're throwing your money down the hole. They have a lot of money to throw away, but they're throwing a lot of money away. So I would basically speak truth to power. Is what I would say. Is if I was consulting for them, that's what I would propose. And then I would think about the product marketing as well. I don't know anyone that uses Portal, but they spend a lot of money on the Portal product too. How could the Portal marketing and the CSR marketing be thrown away, and for them to be a bit more authentic about what they are and what they do, and maybe using some of that money and giving it back to journalists and starting to rethink their perspective as it relates to the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I organize a think tank, and on that think tank we have representatives from some of the biggest companies that we've been talking about. And you know, the reality is that they're well aware that their job is to be inside this organization as a conscience, but not really to raise any problems. Because if you raise a problem, you have to address it. And these big organizations, all they really want to do is preserve their business. That's it. They want to preserve their business, get rid of anyone who's challenging them, but they're making money, so keep things the way they are. The last thing they want to do is evolve. And it seems like it takes a good old scandal the companies to change. You know, it's a solid bit of bad behavior, and that's what will unseat the miscreant and allow the company to evolve. Is that the only way we're going to do this? Because Zuckerberg seems too boring to do anything bad.
I think it is trust busting again for the new century. We need to break up some of these tech companies that have too much power concentrated, are stifling innovation, and are not really forces of good or what they present to be. When you look at countries like Germany, the EU, even China in some ways, they're doing a better job, I think, at keeping these things at a healthier scale versus monolithic or monopolistic sizes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems fairly evident that we're not going to get any positive movement in that way until post November the 3rd. You know, fingers crossed that whoever is elected has a more reasonable and responsible approach. So as we draw to a close, I would really, you know, the idea of this conversation was about communicating core values, and I want to leave people with some sort of positive inspiration. I talked about Honeymaid, you know, there are the Nike Colin Kaepernick supports. It's not just about communicating liberal values. You know, it's not just that. You know, we're talking about sustainability ostensibly. I think sustainability is like a runaway train that you cannot stop. So you either get with it and make money, or you ignore it and look for another job because you're not going to be around. So I'm trying to help people be successful. What kind of advice can we leave people with that is going to, whether they're in a big corporation or they're a small cog, or whether they're an individual, that can actually inspire them to move forward in a positive way?
I say keep on caring. Care a little more, care a little harder about more than just yourself or your bottom line. I know that sounds exhausting, particularly after COVID, but I think that's the only way forward. And I believe that the most noble thing any of us can do in our lives and our business is to serve others. So in so doing, as you do, Simon, as Andrew does, we need to, I think, invite, challenge, inspire, and get others to do the same. And storytelling is one of the key ways of doing it. Give them a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of a challenge. You don't want to condemn someone if that's not going to move the meter for the most part. So we're all smart enough to find clever ways of engaging around brands and causes. And it's all about linking your brand and cause to a higher purpose, I believe.
Andrew?
And I think best intentions and purpose are incredibly important, but transparency about objectives and the relationship between objectives and intentions has to be addressed in a more overt fashion. So going back to the Pepsi spot that you mentioned, Toby, Pepsi had the absolute best of intentions in that spot. I know people who made that. They really meant well. But unfortunately, their objectives were about increasing their bottom line and market share vis-a-vis Coke. And so their good intentions were crushed by overt objectives and bad execution. My point is, it's a complicated equation. There are multiple legs on the stool: sincerity, authenticity, transparency, and it requires leadership that's asking all these questions. And the first question I always ask is, should you be communicating this? Is this the right thing to do? And that's a holistic question. So intentions are just one part of the equation. Understand the consumer's point of view and whether it's welcome or unwelcome, and if it's additive rather than reductive.
Yeah.
Simon, if I may add one other point with these, when you go into these societal issues, I think it's really important, at least is how I've conducted my life and my career. I think it's really important to both try and look at and try and address both the root causes and the symptoms. So we have brands coming out after George Floyd's murder and declaring where they are on social justice, and that's great. And I think most of them are really in it for the long haul, I hope. But we've got to go back to the root causes of systemic racism. It can't just be, I'm going to hire more Black people, because the truth is, you're going to be hard pressed to get the same number of candidates from a Black or brown community with the MBA from Harvard as compared to white, because even though Harvard's done a great job of bringing more diverse students, this is an example, you have to spark the interest in the 4 or 5-year-old kid to want to go on a path and give them the encouragement and the opportunities to get to that point where they will be ready to be picked by a Harvard MBA, which then gets them into a corporation like we're discussing today. So I think it's going to require more caring and more work from all of us to deal with both, in the instance of social justice, with both the root causes and the symptoms.
You know, I think that the thing I would leave with is perhaps I don't know where it came from, but the quote about the person that planted trees, knowing that one day they'd provide shade, but they would be long after they passed away. And I think that, and if you can do that and then find an effective way to let people know that's what you're doing, then that's how you start to build the kind of confidence that people really want to see in you. Anyway, this is the perfect way to start a day. I'm really energized now. Andrew Essex and Toby Usnick, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really enlightening.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, guys.
My pleasure.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day. Bye.